Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we'd like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy Analytics, DAWX, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Wakira, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you.
And relatively, then we could actually get to the precision level of personalization, which basically means hundreds or thousands of personas that are distinguishable by a certain sort of characteristics or clusters. And that level of detail is only done with data at a level of factor of digestion that we perhaps in many parts of insurance haven't gotten to yet. The third part is creating the waves. So when we think about this, it really comes down to how much are we willing to be part of the change and how much are we willing to drive that change. So sometimes in legacy organizations, we typically think about being fast followers. We're conscious of the fact that there's a lot of weight on our shoulders, or perhaps weight on our feet that don't let us go fast enough. So we watch and see, we dabble in some experiments and so on. But if we're really looking for change and survival to thrival, then we're looking for what's going to create that next wave, and can we be part of that creation or be co-authoring that wave as opposed to riding it when it comes. The fourth factor is around building the environment. And in this case, it's not a technical environment we're talking about. We're talking about the people first. I really do think that data and the language of data and technology and analytics are very much driven by the environment that we're building, both the people, the skill sets, the capabilities, the literacy of data, understanding the regulatory footprints that we have to manage around or manage with, and then of course going from there to what's it going to do for the customer. So that entire environment of human to what we call in where I am today, I call it mind plus machine. So human being to our AI and digitally enabled environments. How do we go from there, from A to B? What's that sort of environment look like, and really understanding that collaboration. And the fifth here is user first. So we are in a space and in a world where everything that we do is about multiple people. There's actually a state in our existence that industries are starting to blur, and understanding the user and whether they see us as a insurance company or a risk management company or a risk mitigation company or a safety mechanism, what is it that they see us as, actually starts to change. And so knowing the user firsthand, understanding the user analytics, and building that hyper connection across their network becomes a criticality as we think about how we evolve and start to survive and thrive before we start to perish. So the example that I'm going to share with you now, there are four examples, 4 cases that I'll share with you. Each of the cases are written in such a way that you have an issue to impact approach. A lot of our consulting firms use this as well. I kept it very simple. So if you go from issue to impact, you'll see the first 2 boxes are yellow and pink, I think, and it's an issue and approach. And then it goes into an impact, highlighting a few key factors of the impact that we've made and the approach that we've taken. And then I've also highlighted here, here there are key characteristics, but the blue box will change on each of the slides, and it'll give you hopefully a sense of a checklist that you could consider or look at while you look at this particular example. What were the game-changing factors of the way that we went from this issue to create that impact. On the very, very bottom, you have an example of this particular company, the size and scope of the organization to help you see if that is relevant to your world. So we'll have 4 of these cases. And then after that, I'll share with you 3 active verbs to potentially leverage as you go forward in your organization to see how you can see the next steps. So from here, this particular case is about, as in terms of the abstract, we talked about the multiple strategies organizations have. Interestingly enough, we always have situations where organizations tend to want a data strategy. They may have a business strategy, they may have a technology strategy, and the word strategy gets overly used. So in this particular scenario, I see the examples, the questions here, I'll get to them right away. In this particular scenario, you'll notice that there was a top line support from the CEO. When I joined this organization, we had already spent about a half of the investment dollars allocated for this initiative. 450 million was allocated. About 220 million was already spent on infrastructure and upgrades, so behind the scenes work. And there was no clear, tangible or articulatable information around the business benefit for the customer, the end user. So a lot of question marks of this program was being raised, this initiative was being raised. And so what we did was we looked at 80 plus customers. We stepped back and started to discuss the initiative from their point of view. What were they trying to achieve? This sounds so simple, but typically this would have happened way before the initiative took on. And for whatever it's worth, 3 years in, the initiative had forgotten its original course of goal. So we had to go back and look at the number of people that were there, who were advocates, who were not. We looked at the ROI, their measurement of analysis, and to think about what could happen based on the solutions that were being delivered for this particular initiative. And then we actually helped the businesses sponsor, but also publish scenarios. And it was a very simple if-then statement. Typically in programming, you have if I have this, then I can do that. I've used this in many companies, but the if-then statements were pretty meaningful. So each business unit took an if statement. If I had this, then I will be able to commit to the following things, and here's how. And those statements were published across the organization. And the impact, as you see in the center, were a few things. The first was the binary approach. We diminished the ability at the best possible way for any gray space. So any space where we could say, did this strategy for data align the business strategy or not? If there was a gray space beside a yes or no, we worked quite hard at reducing that gray space. So it was either a yes or a no. We looked at every other strategy that we could find. So in some cases, there was a strategy around go to market. So how does that have to do with the data strategy? How did we connect those strategies together? And if it didn't connect, we put it in the no bucket, and we deprioritized that in that initiative because the business that had chosen a specific ROI to meet and attend to. And you'll notice those things that were gray that we couldn't commit to, that was a yes or a no, we looked for 2 things from those strategies. The first was when would there be so first was that it was an exception. The second was that it had to have a timing of expiration. So we committed to saying, okay, well, this exception will be in existence for about a year. And in a year's time, we want this plan to be either rationalized with the data strategy or aligned with the strategy in a certain way or absorbed. So we had a plan to complete that initiative if it was an exception. And the last example you see on the impact, we went through several reprioritization frameworks. And I think the most critical factor of the framework was that everyone started to use it. It wasn't good when we had several different kinds of prioritization frameworks, but we could agree on 7 different, and that in this particular company, there are 7 different dimensions that we all agreed to. And we published those on the intranet within the organization to look for synergies and opportunities to connect. So when I get to the questions, one of the questions I have here is, what's a successful example of where you have gotten buy-in from a member that's frozen in the middle? Oh, that's a great one. So several times we have people that get frozen in the middle. I would say more often than not, we have one or two advocates, many observers, and several naysayers, right? Several of those that we know are not going to, lift themselves up to help. The ones that are observers are the ones that are frozen in the middle. They're kind of wait and see. And what we've done in the past, there's two things that I've seen work really well. The first is typically their teams underneath them have a sense of the issue at hand, perhaps more than the person at the executive level themselves. So if we can find someone within their remit that understands the connection that we're trying to make, it generally helps. The second is a little bit more obvious. It's to find out their problem and their dilemma, which can be really hard to do. Every organization typically has an annual goal. So we can look at their annual goal and see whether our approach or a particular milestone can help them meet their goal. If that doesn't work, what I have done in the past, which is a little cheeky, I have gone on the round table route. So at the executive level, if I'm sitting in the table, which in this case I was, I've published where everybody is. So at MIT, there's a category of 4 dimensions. If I remember it correctly, it's won't make it happen, we'll watch and see, we'll let it happen, we'll help it happen, and we'll make it happen. So won't make it, we'll watch and see, we'll let it happen, we'll make it happen. And if I put every executive in those categories, what I've done in the past is actually asked them to put their initial in which line of dimension they think they're at. And typically that's an acknowledgement of where they are. And if they are in the point of, we'll wait and see, or won't make it happen, and they can acknowledge that in the front of everybody else, it makes for a very good conversation. And when they are in the we'll wait and see category, then we commit to helping understand from them what will it take for them to go to the next dimension, which was, help it happen. So, help it happen could be something like I've allowed, 10% of some of my colleagues to support the initiative, or I've allowed someone to have or encouraged someone to have a volunteer, initiative towards that data strategy and so on. So I think that's really worked. But the key here was transparency, frankly. The next question here is, how important do you think it is to have a data catalog to support data governance? And do we use a data catalog? So that's a great question. The last several years, we have absolutely used a data catalog, and it's very critical. The thing with the data catalog is that it can be without clear accountability and ownership, and it can kind of go behind the scenes too quickly. So a data catalog is only as meaningful and useful as how updated it is and how people leverage it. So where I've seen success happen in a company that I was with for about 8 years, what we did there was, yes, we had a data catalog, but the catalog had a nurturing factor to the data and the usability of that data. So not only did we have the catalog and the governance body owning that catalog and the history and the lineage and the traceability of the data, but we also connected that with the usage of the data and who was using it for what purposes. So that actually helped other users try to navigate the data catalog for better usage. Typically, the average executive or non-executive in an organization that's not data savvy isn't going to go to the data catalog to see the catalog, but they may go to the data catalog to understand usage of the data. So we have to connect the usage of data with the cataloging and the governance of that data set. So if I finish this particular case, on the right-hand side, you'll see the characteristics. So what made this case really successful? We strategized on both what the strategy was and wasn't. We made sure that the publications that we had and the commitment for the firm indicated what it is and what it isn't that we're solving for. And what it isn't was really clear also. The second thing that was really a game changer was at the end of it, the word strategy became impossible to use. The word strategy was only used when it came to that bigger, grander combined strategy that we had for the organization. In this particular case, there was about 17 strategies that were there in existence when I joined. We went down to one corporate data strategy, sponsored by myself at the time and the CEO that I was reporting into, and that actually forced other strategies to hang off of that particular one. It took several years to do this, by the way. The third point I'm making here is going back to the first question about the frozen middles. Oftentimes there's a perception or even advice that's given to us that you need to have top-down mandate. And it is true, a top-down mandate does help. But the top-down mandate doesn't commit to a solution and doesn't convince everybody in the organization. What starts to convince the organization actually are the other N-2 levels, the ones that don't report to the CEO, but report to those that report to the CEO. And typically those are the individuals that understand the gaps, the mishaps, perhaps the lost in translation factors, where to go from which direction. They understand that a lot more than the executives do. And something to consider, who are the people that you're using as influencers? And the last point I'm making here is actually the metrics and milestones that we use for the data strategy, that the combined data strategy, that all-encompassing version of it, was actually how we went to market. Those metrics were about the market penetration, not about the single source of truth, not about how many versions of control we had and so on. So it was very much a business-driven data strategy. Over the next example, just making sure I can still change screens. Great. So this particular case study, it's not a case study, it's actually a use case for this particular organization, really focused on building the data assets and products. So organizations have a data management, have a product development cycle usually. They typically have product names, the marketing team are aware of those product names and so on. If we apply those principles to the data, it changes the way that we manage, maintain, and leverage our data sets. And we actually start to create a way to monetize our data. And if you have been part of the CDO Symposium here at MIT previously, monetization and data sort of commercialization was a very big topic last year as well. And so it's really important to note that some of the successes that we've seen in the past have to do with how we created the data assets and products. So in this particular example, the issue to impact was specific to the legacy mindset. So this company that I was part of, it was very much on rent seeking. It was a necessary evil, let's say it that way. We had a grand reputation of sort of rent seeking approach of our customers. We really very much didn't have a perception of partnership. It was very driven by sort of one-way conversations or transactional level dialogues. And the route that we took to make a better impact here was we actually started to create our own ecosystem, which allowed us to understand our data and the asset that we had end to end, from beginning to the end. So where the data entered our walls to where it left to our customers. So that entire sort of flow of data was understood and leveraged, or actually designed out. We also built multiple archetypes and portals that people could log into, and then sandboxes of environments where people could actually do analytical analysis and so on. The result of this was quite groundbreaking, and it was a patented capability at the time then, this is several years ago now. But we were able to redirect quite a bit of business users into this new environment, which drove down quite a bit of sort of siloed redundancy, but also increased our customer engagement by 50%. You'll notice here that we actually covered some of the IT savings in a great way, and found a revenue that we were leaking for about 100 million or so. And that was a huge groundbreaking initiative. I think, if I remember correctly, this particular initiative was less than 60 million in terms of investment. So that was already a huge ROI for this particular initiative. And then we also worked with our CFO in this company to create what we call an innovation premium. And this innovation premium changed a lot of our accounting rules to make sure that the data products and assets were actually understood as products with a life cycle, with a lineage, with a name, an association with how we use them for which customers and which customer base. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the biggest power in this particular case was collaboration. We worked with our solutions providers, our businesses, our marketing team, our product development teams across the organization to look at their priorities and use cases. We looked at relevancy. So if a data set or data sets didn't have relevancy to a business use case, we very quickly archived those fields or those factors. And we started to prioritize data by data relevancy in terms of the business need. So not every element was prioritized, not every element was categorized or governed, and only the areas that we thought were going to be game-changing to that particular asset. And data assets became multiple dimensions. So it could be information from weather to cyber to I don't know. In this case, I can remember it was weather, cyber, and aerospace, for example. If you connect all those three things together, that data asset had a very unique characteristic that perhaps is very hard to replicate in a competitor's mindset. The third factor here on collaboration I talk about is identification of owners and influencers. We did touch on this a little earlier. The owners of data and the influencers of how you use that data were identified, were named. We find that the data owners are really hard to gather. In my current company, it's been really quite an obstacle. So what has worked in the past is actually defining that as a job description, part of a JD, and giving that person a sense of what it takes to be a data owner. So it's 2% of your time or 10% of your time. You log in here, you do these 5 things, you check out these 5 factors, and you uphold these guiding principles. And those kinds of things have actually, in my prior organization, worked really, really well. And the last thing is tracking usage. It depending on the size of the organization, this takes a lot of effort, but tracking the usage of the data assets that we've built and published and defined, and then which customer base found the data asset to be useful, and whether that data asset survives another version control or not. Those are really important, powerful sort of mechanisms to create the data assets that we go forward and build. I do have a question here. The question is, would the data catalogs and usage of it not be part of the data literacy stream to empower people to become more and more data savvy? It absolutely would be part of data literacy. Data literacy or analytical savviness, those things are sort of make a prerequisite of data catalogs and data usage. So it absolutely is that in order to be data literate, we need to understand the data governance, the regulatory expectation of the data and how it's housed, minimization of the data, residency of the data, all of those factors do come in, and certainly the usage of the data. So I would say the answer is absolutely. Great. Another comment here is nice case, clearly an added value based on data assets. Great, thank you. I'll keep going. Please jump in with any questions you have. Sorry. Metrics used on case 2. So let me just go back to the metrics used on case 2. There were a couple things. So one of the metrics that we used, which I have used in several organizations and it's worked really well, is reusability. So data assets can become thousands, multiples of thousands, and that can be a problem. But if I'm creating a data asset, one particular data asset, it's a combination of a few things, and it defines a specific problem. What we end up saying is that data asset has X% of reuse of something else. And the reuse factor was really critical. And even in AXA today, we use reuse as a metric for successful data asset build. Another example was scalability. So if I have, it's like a Lego set, right? So if I have one Lego piece and I can add several more, and the scaling is easy to do, the scalability of something like a data asset was also something that we measured in terms of a metric for success. And a third, as I mentioned here, usage and usability of that data asset. So how frequently was a customer referring to the data asset by name? Was it a known factor in the organization? When I talk about the CFO here, we actually had in the line items, data asset ABC, and we measured data asset ABC as a category of something that the company offered to its customer base. So we could say on an annual basis that ABC was used by 50 customers for for X, Y, Z different reasons, and that language helped us immensely to give us validation for the data asset, but also to help us monetize the value of the data that we've just created. All right, going to use case 3 or example 3. So in this particular situation, I'm talking to you a little bit about the accountabilities. Accountability is such a known opportunity for all of us to work towards in an organization. It's a necessary evil also, but it's hard to do, and especially if we're looking at data. Data is everyone's problem and nobody's problem because of that. It's touched by everyone in the organization, and hence, it's hard to figure out who the owners are. From a CDO or CDAO standpoint, it becomes a complicated situation. And frankly speaking, the data owners sit across many not owners, the data influencers, data manipulation, data management, and all those things sit across many parts of organizations. So we may not have a very clear and crisp CDO remit that says all data governance or all data management or all data asset building is in one area, right? We may not have that. And so that creates a lot of difficulty to make solutions possible and to create value in a timely manner. And when we don't have clear accountability, what ends up happening is our target state gets really expensive. Not only it's hard to sort of take on the initiative, but it actually becomes almost threefold more expensive. So in this example, I'll share with you the operating model for this organization had several critical paths. We had about 90 million in actual operations for reserving specifically. The automation tools that were built were in Excel and they were in macro. They were not scalable. A lot of them were done in silos. Some of them were on desktops of individual colleagues and not backed up in production environments at all. The approach that we took here was, so in this issue, we have users that are in the businesses and the actual functions. We have IT that is thinking about automation, and then we have the data areas. All of them not sure who owns what purpose of this particular set of business cases and how to solve them. So what we ended up looking at were the workflows specifically for this area, which was actual reserving. We developed many functional specifications and the use cases for the target state. And then we started to quantify ROI based on both RPA, so robotics automation, as well as artificial intelligence, parts of machine learning, different variations of natural language processing, and so on. The impact was significant, and it was, I recall this situation to be quite intense, to be very frank with you, and I'll give you some factors that are a little bit more clear than what I have on the screen here, but there were a lot of reduction on manual processing. We ended up getting huge benefit and accolades from this initiative, from the automation factors in this organization. We also found that the KPIs, you'll see again this idea of transparency in my mind, publishing the KPIs from the firm-wide standpoint was hugely helpful. Automation initiatives there were too many. They were independent of each other. They almost in some cases actually conflicted with each other. So we started to publish the KPIs, and before any automation initiative took on, they had to go back and look at other automation initiatives and their KPIs that already existed and which one had sort of similarities with what they were intending to do going forward. And the last thing was the culture in the organization changed dramatically. We went from many, dozens of cooks in the kitchen to several cooks in the kitchen, but all of them aware of what they were bringing to the table, their secret sauce that made them sort of indispensable, that they were, and that helped them actually not step on each other's toes. And that actually, this difference, we talk about analytical processing and transactional processing. We started delineating between the AP and TP factors. We started looking at also in this organization in particular, we started looking at things around the lens of D&I. And I don't mean diversity and inclusion by gender or physical attributes, but we actually started creating, in this particular organization, I had created an organization focused on inclusion and diversity. So in this case, inclusion was where we actually had to bring together thoughts. We had to reduce the number of variation. So we created organization structure where we had to include teams together, that they ended up generalizing lowest common denominator sort of structure. And the diversity lens was actually the reverse of that, which was where we wanted to create the diversity of thought and the multiple variation of thinking. We broke those teams into two, and we wanted to have equal footing of both sectors of those teams in those conversations. So this is a different version of D&I that I have been using in my past career. Not so much about characteristics of human beings, but about how dynamics of organizations work. So the questions I have here, let me just really quickly get to that before I get to the blue box. Can you speak more about how you were able to offer access to ABC data as a service to your customers? This is going back to use case 2. Let me get to that after I finish this slide, and I'll answer it before I get to case 4. So on the positive culture part, just to keep the momentum on this particular topic, what we ended up doing was we found ambassadors and influencers, a common theme here you'll notice, but we could not solve the gray space. As a CDO forum at that time, actually I was the president of a digital function, a digital entity, and because I was the president of a digital entity, I was biased towards digital. So we had to create an organization that was separate, a governance body that was separate, that allowed us to understand the gray space, and then from that gray space actually define why that gray space existed. And these influencers and ambassadors actually went to each area and said, do you agree that there's a gray space that looks like, these characteristics? And would you be willing to absorb this or take it on or, abolish it in certain ways or break it into 5 different pieces? So we actually spent a lot of time on that gray space. Instead of sort of hiding behind the scenes and saying, okay, everybody knows their accountability, it should just be done and people should get on with it, which generally does not happen. You start absorbing the pain elsewhere. We hit it head on. The influencers and ambassadors actually, printed out the gray space. We sat in a forum and had a negotiation where we actually brought in a negotiator with us to our meetings in an offsite and worked through the negotiations of how the gray space was going to be managed going forward. And we made a commitment for the next year and a half, 18 months, that's the gray space commitment approach. And we would revisit it in an 18-month window if it didn't work out. The next point here is the challenges. Similar to the idea of up above, I call this de-risking. When there's a dilemma, if we look to fight it ourselves, we typically won't solve it. So I look for others who could help us crowdsource in a way that's kind of equally managing, equally committed to solving towards. And so, for example, in this particular case for the automation and the robotics automation, there was several dozens of RPAs happening. We actually started looking at crowdsourcing. So we brought together an approach that brought teams into a section where they could collectively resolve and solve for an RPA need. It wasn't based on where they sat in the organization. And that crowdsourcing approach brought in huge perspectives. It started making people feel really excited about what they were doing. We heard what I then called epic stories. And I started publishing epic stories. There were 5 dimensions of those stories out there, and started sort of explaining the benefits of what we were seeing in this collaborative nature. And the last point here is accountability in the KPIs. Yes, it really does, what you measure is what you get. So for every executive, we did put in their annual goals, KPIs that had to do with culture and empowerment and accountability. Okay, so going back to the question that was at hand. So I see here, it's the ABC, the service to the customer. So the question was, how do you offer access to data set ABC as a service to your customers. So if a customer in that example was looking at risk mitigation for cyber, for example, which is a hot topic right now, and they needed to understand their cyber threats or product suites that are being sold on the cyber environments a little bit better, and we had a perspective on that. We may have a data asset that we've created that understands geographic reach, understands geospatial things, or understands a technical due diligence of what creates a real cyber threat. What are the factors of data or characteristics that help us understand that cyber threat? Now we can give the data, or we can clean it up and send it to the customer as fields, or we create a product out of it, product ABC, and we say this product suite does helps us understand information about cyber threats these different ways, and it has a perspective according to geographic region. I don't know. It could be language. It could be sort of a holistic nature of the type of country, company that you're in, the industry that you're in. If that data set connects all those factors, we start to call that data set to the customer as a product that they're able to use. And when a customer uses that product, they're championing the set of data that we actually pull together to make the data set. I don't know if that answers the question clearly, but the customer actually doesn't care what the data set is. It just cares, I used ABC. And us will have to then think about, okay, well, that's great. ABC is being used by 25 customers. I got to make it better. I've got to create a better version of it, and so on. What have I learned from the users of the data, and so on. I hope that helps. And ask again if it didn't, please. Okay, last question, and I want to make sure that we have ample time. Great. Last use case. So in this use case, clarity of target state, it kind of comes back full circle. So too many data strategies or too many strategies creates lack of clarity. But understanding your bullseye is a really important task. And I would say that it takes months for us as an organization and for lots of mindsets to agree on a target state. And what ends up happening is we don't generally agree on a target state until we make it bigger than ourselves. So if we look at a target state for our CDO function, it may not be that much agreed on by other areas of the organization. If you look at it as a target state for our particular line of business, it may not be as agreed on by other lines of businesses. So we do need a target state that is grander than the function that we're sitting in today. And that's pretty critical. So the target state kind of believes and behaves like a mission statement in an organization, but it has the characteristics of measurability. And that's what I think is a good use case for you to hear about today. In this particular issue, we had massive imprecision. We were not able to analyze reconciliation of data across many different parts of the organization. The target state was several different things to several different people. If we went across the organization and asked, the number of enforced policies, we would get multiple different answers. If we asked the top 10 customers, they would be 20 different versions of the top 10 customers. And that was a tough situation to be in, right? So the approach that we took to gain the impact that we identify here is actually an evaluation of our data and technology architecture. We looked at the back end limitations, and what had happened, which was part of the issue that we realized, was that the organization actually had an easier time working with vendors, external parties, than it did its own data and IT teams. It was cheaper, faster, easier to measure, easier to adopt if they just used vendor mechanisms. And so that actually created a huge tension across the businesses that were using the vendors and the data and IT teams that wanted to have those skill sets and really wanted to be building those great grand ideas for the future of the company. So those were kind of underlying issues that we were seeing. The assessment, the approach that we took was a global view of collaboration across the actual functions. In this particular case, the digital capabilities that were going to allow this organization to make faster precision in their analytical and actuarial decisions. So for example, the target state initially, because there were so many versions, none of them included something like adverse bias. So if I'm doing data work or building data models, and I'm only using the data I have in-house, it's likely that the data is very much already sort of limited because it's only the data I have in-house. What I want to be able to do is get that data in-house married with the data sets that I've not been able to consume yet. So for example, from pricing standpoint, we would want to be able to look at data that we have about what we've priced already, but also the data that we didn't get to, or the policies or the products that we didn't get to that we were going to price if we had the time. So we want that data connection and then build models across that. So that's an example of what a target state would look like in a real sort of thoughtful way versus I can get to this now, so let me just get to it now, right? We don't want to sort of a knee-jerk reaction. So a thoughtful target state might encompass ways to mitigate adverse risk selection or adverse bias. In this particular example, we were able to actually support a lot of the global workflow in this organization. We exceeded quite a bit of our reduction goals for operational expenses. We simplified our submission processes, and we increased our annual membership quite a bit on the collaborative side for activities. And on the right hand, you'll notice, I do want to get to the last couple slides, so you'll notice the culture factor here. I tell the team that I've been with for a long time, is that we have, the only thing that keeps me up at night is culture. So I want to make sure that we get to these. The statements have to be undisputable. Whatever you're doing in terms of the target state, everybody has to say that's exactly what I want to be like. That's exactly where I want to go with the company. It has to be undisputable. It can't be, yeah, but not really. We don't want that. We want the statement for the target state to be very undisputable. The second is we want it to be a dynamic chain reaction. That statement, that target state has to be almost a kicker to get us to get up off our seats and make things happen. So it has to create a flywheel effect. And the third here is it's got to be measurable. It goes back to measurement. OKRs, our objective and key results, have to be defined with that target state in mind. Okay, so in my 10 minutes left, or 9 minutes left, I'm going to quickly get us to the last couple adjectives I promised you, or active vocabulary, active verbs. So the first active verb is compare. So here's something I did just for our discussion today. I looked at insurance companies out there and looked at their about page, scrape the about page and put them into the words as is into a cloud online, right? And you can do this for yourself in your industries. Take the about page for those competitors that you have and yourself and put it in and see what words come out. And then see what words come out of companies that you think are cutting edge in your space. And for legacy insurance, you'll notice in the about page, they talk about services, insurance, companies, financial, there's customers, there's providing property, casualty, and so on. But when you look at what we think are digitally enhanced or digitally sort of cutting edge insurance companies, really important words come up like experiences, customers are bigger, needs, innovation comes up, businesses come up, remarkable, values, and there are certainly words like insurance still there and services still there. But a food for thought is something that you can do to see, how is your company sort of owning the idea of the power of data and what it can do? Is it in that mindset yet or not? Another particular one I can say that you could look at is assessing. So I often speak about digital transformations in lots of organizations and lots of symposiums and conferences. And I talk about these 4 quadrants. I think this is I built this out back in 2014 or maybe even 2010, a long time ago. But there's 4 categories. And the x-axis here is how we think about our products. And the y-axis is how we talk to the customer. And if you think about where you are, you can see and assess, where are you in that strategy of becoming a digitally savvy, data savvy company. The last one is monitoring. So, you know, the new normal of companies and organizations that leverage data that CDOs and CDAOs empower the company with have something as fundamental as self-service at their center: benchmarking, co-creation, recommendation engines, programmable APIs, and ROI tracking at the center of their new normal. These aren't things that they're thinking about 5 years from the road. They're actually working on these things right away. So any new normal company is going to have these factors, so something to consider for yourself as well. And with that, if there's any more questions, Elizabeth, I'm happy to answer anything that you have. I will close off by saying this was really nice. I hopefully answered the question that you already did spend with me. And I have one quote, I forget who said this, it's not me, but one food for thought, as always. We always work hard for a lot of things, and hopefully we're going to be able to get to success whenever we put the effort into it. Elizabeth, over to you. Any other questions? You might be on mute, Elizabeth.
Well, technology. I'll have this down by Thursday afternoon. I'm just super impressed with your whole presentation. Your case studies were informative and meaningful. Obviously, it eluded questions from the audience, and you handled all of them in an expert fashion. So we can't thank you enough. There's no more questions, and we can probably all get 5 more minutes of the bio break that's coming up for us right now.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you very much.